Hello and good morning, everybody. I hope you are well. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Bethany and I will be monitoring the chat and helping if you have any technical issues throughout. Today we'll be presenting what's new in FME 23. Your host for today's session will be Martin Lufkin and I will hand over to him shortly. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. You have all been placed on mute. However, we welcome your comments and questions by typing these into the chat panel. We will address these at the end of today's webinar in the Q&A session. However, if we don't get a chance to answer your question, as we do have a lot to cover, do not worry, we will follow up with you afterwards. Today's webinar is being recorded and we will share the link with you after the webinar within the next 24 to 48 hours via email. Finally, we are very excited about the One Spatial World Tour, which will feature FME in June. We will be coming to Leeds on the 8th, London on the 13th and Cardiff on the 15th. We will also have on hand our FME certified trainers and professionals. So if you have any questions, you can ask these in person and directly to them. Please register as we do have limited seating for the events. Okay, over to you, Martin.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to the One Spatial webinar for what's new in FME 23. Thanks for joining us, and I hope it will be a useful session for you. As Bethany has mentioned, my name is Martin Lufkin. I'm part of the FME team of certified professionals here at One Spatial, and we're really excited about some of the changes and new features being brought in FME 23. And we're going to take a dive into a couple of those features that I hope are going to be of interest to you. So firstly, we can't ignore the rebrand. SAFE have new logos and new names for the products. FME Desktop is now known as Form. FME Server is now Flow. And there's some nice little logos to match those products now. Now, after many years, it's very tricky remembering to call the products this, but we'll try throughout this session to refer to them with their new names. But apologies if I do slip into the old names, though. So let's move into the detail of what's new within Form and Flow. And this can be broken down into three main categories: speed to insights, team collaboration and productivity, and operational efficiency. And we're going to focus on one of these at a time. So the first section we're going to look at is speed to insights. And every year, SAFE make performance improvements. Their work last year has been improvements in the performance of transformers that utilize bulk mode. And the process we're seeing on the screen now is a point on area overlayer. And it overlays about 16 million points over a range of polygons. Now this in 2020, this took about 7 minutes to perform, but in the latest release, it's taking about 20 seconds. And these are all under the hood changes. So upgrading to the latest version of FME Form is required for that. SAFE say that the total number of output ports that support this bulk mode is now between 330 and 340. This is their measure of how many transformers they've completed, which pretty much means that all the transformers where bulk mode makes sense to be in have been completed. It's also worth mentioning that memory usage has also gone down because basically the transformers have been rewritten based on the theory that the structure of the data remains the same for each feature within that data set. Essentially, it's instead of every feature carrying an identical heavy rucksack of schema information slowing each one down, the idea is that the first feature carries the heavy rucksack and the others don't. And all of them, all the subsequent features are assumed to have the same structure as the first. and that significantly speeds those features up through the transformer. One of the big improvements is the rendering of 2D data within Inspector. It's much quicker to load initially now. Going back to the previous point overlayer example, we don't want to have to wait 5 minutes for these 16 million features to draw. And it's also dramatically quicker to pan. Safe acknowledge that they're looking to continue enhancing the performance of Inspector for viewing raster, point cloud, and 3D data. Dynamic published parameters. So this is a feature that we're all getting quite excited about. It's well overdue, and I think it's going to offer a lot of great uses. But rather than me just trying to describe it, let's have a quick demo to see what it can do. So to demonstrate this, we've got a very simplistic workspace. This workspace reads in a JPEG image, which is a one spatial banner image. It runs through a raster resampler, which in this case will actually reduce the resolution of it. It writes it out to an output JPEG, and if we go and run this workspace, we can see the parameters that are associated with it. And these are fairly common parameters because they're created as part of the reader and writer setup. It's the input source JPEG file and the output location of where we're writing the JPEG. And we can go ahead and run that just to see whether that works. And we can inspect the raster resampler and make sure that it's working as intended. And as you can see here, it's a reduced resolution image compared to the original. But what we want to create is some more parameters and actually create some conditional visibility characteristics on these. And the raster resampler is a really good example of a transformer here because it already has this built-in functionality that we want to emulate and that we'll try and recreate. Now, if you've never used the raster resampler before, it has 3 settings. You can either do a resample based on the desired number of rows and columns. These are the cells or pixels of your image. You can base it on cell spacing, which is actually the size of the cells, or you can do it on the percentile. You can do it on the percentile. So it basically takes the input image and reduces it to a percentage of it. Now, whatever you select here will control what's available in the parameters that are immediately below. So if you have rows and columns selected, then you only select from these 2. Cell spacing enables you to select from these 2 and disables the others, and percentage enables the last one. Now, if we wanted to start parameterizing this transformer, it's fairly straightforward. Just go to user parameters and we can create a user parameter for this one. Now, something you might have noticed is that when we create this, that all of them are now enabled. It's because the transformer no longer knows what we're selecting because we're only selecting it at runtime. That's fine. We can work with that for now. And we'll go ahead and create the parameters for all of these values. And we'll even create a parameter for the interpolation type, which basically is how we derive those new values for the output cells. We click OK, and we have now parameterized everything in this transformer. So when we go and have a look at our parameters, we've got a whole big mess of parameters. So, as you can see. So what we're going to do first is we're going to create a group box here. Now, if you're not aware of group boxes, I highly recommend that you start using them because they're really, really useful. And we'll call this group box raster params. And we'll give it a title of raster resampling parameters. And now we can put all of our parameters that we've just created into that group box. We'll move the input and output parameters down to the bottom. We'll deal with these in a moment. So conditional visibility rectifies an issue that historically we've had when we're running this kind of parameter setup. Just like we saw in the transformer, we have to interact with all of them, even though we know we're only going to use a subset of them. So say we're looking to use rows and columns, we still have to fill in the values for the spacing ones and the percentage ones just to make it happy. Now, we could make these not required, but they would still be visible. And users could still put something in, and it doesn't really accomplish anything. So conditional visibility will save us here. When you want to use conditional visibility, you just need to select your parameter of interest and tick the conditional visibility field, and this will present you with an if then else choice, something that's fairly common in FME. And when we can we can denote the if statement, which will be if a parameter is something or is not something. Now, the parameter we're interested in is the row, column, and cell size, the first parameter we created. And if this is equal to rows and columns, you'll see that it's pre-populated with the values of our list already. And then we can denote what happens in response to this being true or false. If it's true, we'll show as enabled, and if it's false, we can show as disabled, which is fairly synonymous with how the workspace, the transformer works. The additional option here is to hide. We'll come on to this shortly. But for now, we'll just do the enabled and disabled, and we'll remove the default value. So I'm effectively doing this now for replicating this across each of my initial options. Now, when we get down to the interpolation type, we're going to leave as is, because actually it's applicable to all of them. But if we go ahead and click OK to run this, you can see that it very much looks like the way the raster resampler presents these parameters. If we have rows and columns selected, then we can only select these two and the others grayed out. If we swap to cell spacing, then we only have the cell spacing parameters. If we swap to percentage, we'll have to input just a percentile, which maybe is 50 in this case. And then we can go and hit run. And in fact, this will pick up the parameters and go and use them accordingly. We're now making the choice for our users so much nicer by blocking out the irrelevant choices from them. This is so much easier to navigate. So we can also hide parameters too, based on the same logic. We can use these existing input and output parameters. So let's say we want to make those available to only people who, let's say, have an administrative level of access. So basically, you need to know a certain password or a certain key phrase to be able to specify the input and outputs. Otherwise, you're not allowed to change them. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create another group box. And let's call this one admin control. And we'll make this group box collapsible and collapse by default. We'll put in the two existing parameters for these, and we don't want to hide them yet. We want to leave them published, but we want to conditionally hide them. So we add a new parameter, and this is going to be a text parameter. Now this text parameter, we could use a password parameter, but the conditional visibility doesn't work on password parameters just yet, though we suspect it will in the future. So we'll use a text parameter for now, and we'll title this parameter admin pass. And now we've got this field here, we can now enter some text into, and we can now specify conditional visibility based on this text box for both input and output parameters. And so we'll go to admin pass. And you may have noticed here this list is only aware of the parameters that are above it. So if we have an admin pass phrase below, then these would not be available to select. So we'll go to the source. We'll go to the source and we'll tick conditional visibility, and if admin pass is one spatial demo, we'll type in here. Now, what we want to do is, if this is true, then show as enabled, else hide it. So we don't want it to be shown if the admin pass phrase, we only want it to be shown if the admin pass phrase is entered. It's the same on this one. So conditional visibility, admin pass is one spatial demo, and again, if it's true, show as enabled, else hide it. So if we go run this now, you'll notice actually that we've made a mistake. And we need to set the admin passphrase to optional. Otherwise, the user must add something there. So we'll go in and we'll untick the required box. So now we can go and run the workspace. We have a raster resampling parameters to fill in, but we also have a collapsed by default admin controls box. When we open this up, we can see that there's a passphrase to enter, and the moment the passphrase is typed in correctly, the additional parameters appear, and we can go ahead and start changing the input and output locations. So, conditional visibility of parameters. It cleans up the user parameter experience, and the overall viewing and usability of the parameters is so much nicer. So moving on, the attribute manager and that attribute creator are some of the most popular transformers amongst users. So FME 23 form now allows users to define the schema centrally at one point. So these transformers don't change or cast the values. This occurs at the writer when automatic user attribute definition is set. But assigning the data types here in the attribute manager or attribute creator has been made much, much easier. There's also support for upsert functionality now within the OGC GeoPackage writer. Previously there, you had to determine the type of action on a feature and supply it via the FME DB operation attribute. The SQL creator and executor transformers now have support for geodatabases. So the same querying within those transformers can now be done inside that format as well. Apache Parquet is a file-based storage format. Its structure is column-based rather than row, meaning that depending on your data structure, it can be many more times efficient to store and query compared to text-based row-orientated formats. Common format you're probably aware of is CSV. Parquet is a binary format with compression, therefore making it more efficient than CSV for storing, querying, and transferring when disk-based storage of data is required. This was in FME 2021 as a tech preview for Parquet, but now it's fully supported with readers and writers. And there's a new transformer, the classifier. This sorts and groups features into user-defined numbers of classes based on an attribute value, and it stores that class ID as a specified output attribute. It's a group-based transformer, and it can be really useful when used alongside something like the feature color setter to visualize classifications. There's a Databricks reader writer now in FME, also a connector in there as well. You can now do queries as you would do in any other database into Databricks. And there's lots of other new and expanded formats. ArcGIS Server Feature Service Writer, which is the ability to effectively write to a feature service via a REST API. There's no need to interact with the API yourself. FME takes care of that for you. Azure Synapse, which is an analytics platform product on Azure. There's readers, writers there. Airtable has readers and writers. Precisely, which is a multi-resolution raster format developed originally by Pitney Bowes. It's a good container for storing multiple rasters within. FME can now write to that format too. And NDJSON, new line delimited JSON, which means every collection of features is on a new line, which if you've ever used JSON, you know everything is hierarchical. NDJSON slightly changes that. So each new line might be a single feature or collection, but its own standalone object. It's a really good format for streaming, as each line has its own valid JSON object. It's easier to read on the fly as opposed to waiting for the whole JSON file to be read. And we can't go through without mentioning generative AI is fast becoming at least a talking point within the data world. And SAFE have been able to deliver open AI connectors within FME 23. Don't know much more about these, but look out for SAFE's webinars on more information on these transformers. So the second section, team collaboration and productivity within FME 4. So SAFE are looking to facilitate more of a group-based working approach within FME users, understanding that often workspaces are not necessarily authored and modified by an individual, but increasingly more collaboratively. The platform itself obviously needs to reflect this. So development has been made to streamline workflows, centralize documentation, and create customizable tools more easily. So increasingly there is a requirement for multiple authors to be working on the same workspace. So finding the differences between the two becomes really important. And in coding, a diff function can be used, but it's a little bit more tricky in FME. As some of you may know, in 2022, FME introduced the Workspace Compare and Merge tool. And it's had some changes in 23 based on SAFE's user experience feedback and research that they've carried out. It's now a little simpler, and it's now just a basic left-right comparison rather than old and new. And this is great for understanding differences within workspaces, but it's also useful for going back to find where you maybe have changed a part of the workspace which now doesn't work. We're not aware of anyone else trying to compare visual workflows like this, so this is actually quite a big deal, especially for the larger organizations with multiple FME users. And SAFE is still working on improving it. Having made large changes to the interface in 23, they're trying to further align it to what a diff function would provide in code. Trimble Connect is another common data environment, a CDE, being utilized for storing, managing and sharing documents. Similar to Autodesk 360 and Bentley ProjectWise, it's another enterprise tool for managing information. There's a new connector transformer available on the hub to integrate with Trimble Connect. And because it's on the hub, it can be used in FME Desktop 2022 or newer. And Revit. Revit is a popular yet highly complex format for 3D information. It's got many uses, one being the coordination of multidisciplines and federated project deliverables. FME support for Revit has been progressing over the past few years mainly because of the complexity of the format. Writing is now supported for 3D meshes in Revit files, just as a starting point to get data, outside data, into the format, creating what is known as a slim bin model. Point instances are the next type of feature that SAFE are looking to tackle when it comes to Revit. A transformer designer. So this particular feature is fairly exciting if you're building or working with custom transformers. If you're not familiar with a custom transformer, it's a neat way to enable you to create and package up a small piece of transformation logic into a single transformer, which makes it easier for reuse in your own workspaces or sharing with others in your organization or even on the FME hub. The transformer designer shown here appears to be, and I say appears to be because it's not available in the beta versions that we've had access to yet, but it appears to be a standalone application to improve the design of the transformer interfaces for users and FME add-in developers. I think this combined with the new dependent user parameters provide a really comprehensive set of tools to configure custom transformers. And finally, the last section, operational efficiency within FME Flow. So deployment parameters are a feature to enable you to easily manage and migrate FME Flow components between different environments. For example, a workspace is published to your test environment. It uses a database connection into your test database, and it might write out some data into another piece of test environment infrastructure. The workflow is triggered by an automation maybe that also is related to incoming events occurring in that test environment. Publishing this to dev and prod becomes much quicker using deployment parameters, as these are set within the workspace and then left, meaning that they can reference the correct database connections and the other environment infrastructure without having to go into the workspace to change the settings. This is a big step forward to be able to have a link. It's also a big step forward to be able to have a link between your form, desktop, and flow, server, instances, sharing parameters to and from each other. Let's see this in action. So to get started with deployment parameters, you typically have to start in FME Flow. So to navigate to this new feature, you need to go to Connections, Parameters, and Deployment Parameters. And it's here that we can specify our individual parameters. Now, everything we create here, you can think of as global variables in the sense that they're actually available to both FME Flow, the server solution, and FME Form, the developer solution. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a new one. So let's say I want to create a parameter for Postgres connection. I actually have Postgres connection here for dev, test, and prod environments on this machine. So perhaps I'm going to call this Postgres connection. And I'll specify database connection. You can specify text, database, or web connection currently, and I can even give it a default choice, and you'll see it pre-populates what I've already got, and this will be our test connection. So I can click add, and it's done. I might want to add one more, and let's call this, let's add an email to parameter. The idea being that this can be used to denote a service desk or a particular technical person. If something goes wrong, or you need to send a status report to somebody, that you can actually use this parameter to reference it. So the type will be text, and we'll just put a colleague's email address in here. So the two deployments are ready to be used. Now, if I want to use these, I will perhaps start with FME Form. So here I've got a brand new workbench here, and before we start using them, what we need to ensure is that we're connected to FME Flow. So you can see in the top right that I am connected to my demo FME Flow. So I should be able to retrieve these parameters. Now, the first one was the database connection. So I'll start with the SQL Creator transformer. I'll specify my connection type to be Postgres. And instead of using one of the existing interface connections or even embedding it, we'll go to user parameters, FME deployment parameters, Postgres connection. And now you see it's actually retrieving the name of the connection that we would use from FME Flow. So I can now put together a SQL statement. It's a good idea to check this is connecting, and you can see here there's a table that exists, so we know it's connecting. So I might write something like select all from FME tips, and we'll limit it to one, so we'll just pull back one of these tips. So after exposing the attributes quickly, we should be able to see a single tip coming out with an author, and the tip from this is FME Flow, deployment parameters are cool, which I don't disagree with, to be fair. So this uses our first parameter. Our second one was an email to parameter denoting an email address. So if you want to use that, we might perhaps use an email transformer. So let's go ahead and connect this up. We've prepared the details here earlier by making a preset, which will populate the SMTP and the username and password. But what it doesn't populate is the to field, which is who this is going to. Here we can place our new deployment parameter. So we go to user parameters, FME deployment parameters, and email to. And so if this email recipient is different from our test environment, our dev environment, and our prod environment, because they have different owners, this will just pick this up automatically because each one of those flow installations will have a different value for this parameter. So I can click OK, and I can just run that through to make sure it works. But this is only half of the equation using them in the client FME Form. As I mentioned, we can in fact use these in FME Flow as well. These can be treated as global parameters. And so a common thing that we might want to do is maybe create an automation, for example. And in this automation, I will go ahead and I'll just put in a manual trigger to get started. And perhaps an action will be to run a workspace. And perhaps we'll use the workspace we just ran, the deployment parameters one. Now, a very common thing that people like to do in automations, including myself, is to add an emailer to the workbench failed port. This will send an email if the workflow failed and send it to a person of interest. They can then be notified and they can do something about it. So when we're going to set up our email action under email to, you will see we have access to the usual options that we're used to in automations, including the automation parameters that were previously known as global keys, and the stuff coming from the preceding blocks, such as event and the workspace. But down at the very bottom, there's event and workspace. So down at the very bottom, we have something new and actually quite special, the deployment parameters, where we can use that email to field. Once we've got that and we fill in the remaining fields, we can go ahead and use it in the same way that our workbench is using it. So deployment parameters give us what are effectively global parameters to be used in both environments. And whenever you update it for one in one location, you update it for everything. So deployment everywhere. So anyway, until now, the guidance that we at One Spatial and Safe used to recommend was to put FME flow as close to your data as you can. This was to limit and reduce the network overhead of transferring data to and from FME flow, or for a security principle of having your data remain in its environment, on-prem or in cloud vendors' environment, and not to traverse a long and potentially unsecure network link or to avoid any associated cloud costs. What this meant was a key decision had to be made, where to put your FME flow deployment if you had, for example, had data and services on-prem, but you also utilize cloud services, but not anymore. FME flow makes the process of configuring a hybrid deployment. What this means is that you may have an FME flow deployment that is configured with the core and some engines in a cloud environment, but you might also have an ArcGIS portal environment on-prem. What this deployment enables is for you to have engines to be located in your on-prem environment as part of a single FME flow deployment and doesn't require data to be shifted out of that native environment. Safe have now simplified the connectivity configuration for those remote engines. So FME flow jobs can run as close to the data, and the licensing and the administration is suddenly much easier. So these remote engines allow you to use queues and run jobs on remote installations of FME flow that can be closer to your data. You can create and connect to a remote engine on an FME flow instance that is part of your network, or on a separate FME flow configured in the cloud, such as FME flow hosted, the new name for FME Cloud, or Azure Functions, or Google Cloud Functions. Also, automations now support more HTTP methods to integrate with other services. So the webhook trigger functionality previously was a post request only, but now it supports a wider range of methods such as put, delete, etc. This will lower the bar in integrating with FME flow via the REST API. The get method will come later, but it's not available yet. And finally, infrastructure as code. So the changes in FME Flow 23 enables administration and deployment of FME Flow via the command line easier. Using the command line to deploy FME Flow is not new. It's been possible for a while. However, there has been some improvements to the process, and we're seeing some of those flash passed on the command line here. You're seeing a deployment of FME Flow, then a token being retrieved, followed by a submission of a job request to run a particular process. These scripts being shown here form the basis of a CI/CD pipeline to automate the deployment of FME Flow within your organization. What this means is that you can follow a more traditional IT development process of publishing and testing workflows in a CI/CD type workflow. FMWs can be version controlled in a Git type repository, then using a GitHub runner, have it handle the publishing and unit testing of those workspaces. So that's it. FME 23 has been released, I believe. So go to safe.com/downloads and start using some of these additional features. We're slightly over time as there was quite a lot to fit in, but have we got any questions coming through? Not that I'm aware of.
Any questions, please do pass them over and we will get back to you in the next 24 hours.
That's great, thank you very much. And there'll be an extended session on what's new in FME 23 at the One Spatial World Tour, as well as a chance to ask further questions to our FME Certified Professionals. So please do sign up and we'll look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.